Okay, right. Good morning, everyone. Hope you all had a good evening last night. I found yesterday's session really inspiring, and you'll think some of the things I'm going to say this morning, I think, link back to that, and hopefully will link back to the OSPO section later on as well. I'll explain who I am about 3 slides on, because I want some interaction. Who remembers Log4Shell? And were you delighted when your CAO said, are we infected? And you're going to say, yes, give me 10 minutes and I'll tell you whether we are? Always says, where do I start? So how many were thumbs up and how many were heads in hand? So this session is going to hopefully make us have more thumbs up. Okay, who am I? I'm old. I've been in the software industry for 40 years. So I've seen code generate, mature. I predate open source. So a lot of the systems I wrote were legacy systems, what you call legacy systems, very proprietary systems. But for the last 20 years, I've been pushing open source in the organization I used to work for. I'm now an independent consultant, and the thing in the left-hand side there is the B, the Manchester B. I'm part of a cyber startup program in the UK, trying to inspire future cyber startups outside London, because we actually have a lot of cyber business in London, but we need to try and spread the love outside the capital. But I also do, picking up what was said before, I'm also great for outreach. So I teach students Python in things like Codadojo. I educate students in the delights of the engineering world and how they can use their maths and their computing and the engineering to do great things. And I'm a mentor for Google Summer of Code, so I'm mentoring some students currently on some open source projects. And I also do a little bit of running, just to keep the brain fresh. And it's also the time where I do a lot of thinking. So, enough of me. What's an SBOM? So I was struck by the talk about food facts yesterday afternoon. Do we know what's in that burger? Do we know where all those ingredients have come from? Do you know all those ingredients? How have we customized that burger? Have we all got that relish? Have we all got that mayonnaise? Do we know where that mayonnaise actually came from? Do we know where the beef came from, where the cow was? Okay? And the answer is probably no. But we always, when we go to a restaurant, they said, have we got any allergies? Because they don't want those allergic reactions and someone's been ill. Why aren't we doing the same for software? The equivalent of software now, software ingredients, is things like libraries, frameworks, other applications. The reactions are vulnerabilities. And the reactions is exploits. So are we asking those questions now for all our software that's being installed or deployed in any of our business systems, any of our technical systems, any of our supply chain? So this is sort of the more understandable what an SBOM is. It's metadata. And I'm going to talk about metadata, the importance of metadata later on in this presentation, because it's really important as a community we actually get the right metadata. But the beauty of SBOMs is it should be shared within the teams and within organizations. And what I'm seeing at the moment is that's not happening sufficiently well. I know there are some good instances. I've certainly had the chats with people yesterday. I know that's starting to happen, but that's not widespread yet. And it needs to be part of your risk strategy. If you don't know what's inside your software, how are you able to manage the risk of your business, the products that are being delivered to your customers? So it's risk. Software risk is what I'm all about. And there are 2 standards. So there's in the left-hand side, SBDX. Linux Foundation, and they started in the open source looking at software licenses, the importance of looking at licenses in all your components and tracking those licenses. It's obviously morphed into looking at wider things other than licenses. On the other side, you've got Cyclone DX, which is coming from the OWASP community, another great open source community. And they're looking at the software bill of materials, and they're growing it in to look at things wider than just software, look at things like hardware, operational systems as well, looking at the whole of an operational system. There's good interaction between the two, but I'm starting to see some deviation, which is good. Regardless of what with either standard, basically an SBOM consists of 3 components. You've got some metadata, which is saying, when was it created? And that's quite important, what version you've used, who's created it. You've then got the components, the metadata associated with the component, like the name, like its version, like where it's come from, the supplier. And then you've got the relationships, and the relationships are really important. That tells you that library is used by that component. So you can start looking at things like change. If I change that library, then that application is impacted. Or if there's a vulnerability in that library, that tells me where the impact is going to be. And I know this is a very busy slide because there's a lot happening. But really, SBOMs really started, before this slide, the SolarWinds is really the trigger. I think the US government got really upset about the SolarWinds and the impact the SolarWinds had because of how it was done. It impacted the supply chain really deeply. So President Biden, one of the first thing President Biden did was he launched what's known as the exec order in May 2021. And I know a lot of us were all busy with COVID, etc. But as this started happening in May, and they were saying we need to improve cybersecurity for federal systems was their target. I don't think it matters just federal systems, it's all systems. And then Log4j happened, and I think that really crystallized the importance of what they were after, because SBOMs were part of the exec order, were suggested as a way of improving the transparency of the software. Log4j basically said, we've got a long way to go. Which is why Linux Foundation said, are we ready for the SBOMs? The answer is probably not. Then the OpenSSF then started launching initiatives to actually grow the ecosystem, grow education, grow the tooling. And that's where we are today, really. We're growing tooling and we're growing education, and we need to carry on the education. Yesterday, there was a big SBOM meeting, 900 people attended in the US. These people are starting to get their headwind, and it was not just the US, people were from Europe as well. So things are starting to happen. We've then got the COA, and the COA, I think, in terms of resilience of software, SBOMs will be part of that solution. Now, it'd be great to understand how people see the COA, because I know it's got some issues with the open source community. But actually, SBOMs covers not just open source, it will include proprietary, so there will be some benefits. UK now, we have to do things slightly differently, because we're not in the EU anymore, so we've got something similar. But the first real test of the industry is the medical device market in October. So the Federal Drugs Agency in the US are requiring that any medical device publishes a bill of materials and the associated vulnerabilities of all the components that that medical device has. That's quite onerous. And that will apply to anybody in Europe selling to the US, which I'm sure we have some, certain organizations here will probably be affected by that. So there's a lot happening. And SBOMs apply throughout your life cycle. Software doesn't stay still, we all know that. And it can be applied in terms of identifying, when you're selecting a component, use an SBOM to identify what's in that component. Maybe you're doing a merger and acquisition, identifying all the components and then assessing the quality of the development. But you can see various ideas there: build integrity, license compliance, vulnerability management, change management. There are a multitude of use cases to consider an SBOM for. An SBOM has a life cycle in itself as well. So don't just think once you've generated an SBOM, That's the job. This is where I think there's the problems we've got now, is people aren't really are thinking that's job done. We actually need to start looking inside the SBOMs and interpreting the information that an SBOM is providing to allow us to drive our process. So let's do some analysis. Let's identify whether we've got issues with licenses or out-of-date software or software we don't understand. We say, oh, why is that component there? To prioritize your development and then to do some remediation. So you'll see that all the product team are involved, the dev team, the build team, the governance team, and the CISO is probably quite happy he's got some oversight. However, there are a number of challenges I've already seen, and SBOMs is sort of relatively young, but I'm still already seeing a number of challenges. So I'd like to share those with you now. The first thing is licensing, and I know we've got to talk about licensing in the next session. Can we be consistent with the way we specify software licenses? The number of times I see Apache 2, or is it Apache 2.0, or is it Apache-2.0, or Apache even? Can we be consistent whenever we specify in the metadata of an open source component the license? SBDX has a set of license identifiers. Can we use that consistently in all our source files, in all our built components? Secondly, can we be consistent in the naming? Naming is really important. If people want to use SBOMs for vulnerability management, they need to be able to look up the application name against a database. We need to have a consistent way of doing that. And there are a multitude of ways of doing it. Let's try and find a consistent way as industry where that's going to work across lots of databases and across lots of tools. We then need a better way of identifying the versioning. I hear some vendors change product to fix vulnerabilities, maybe backport fixes. Really good. But actually, it's not easy to identify that they've done that work. It might still look as a version 2.1 of a component. It's not really 2.1 component, but there's no better way of indicating that it's a modified version of 2.1. We need a way of improving that. Quality. I am not seeing consistency in SBOM tools. So if you use two tools to generate an SBOM, for your application, you're likely to going to get two different SBOMs with two different sets of content. So we need to be careful to basically, when we say I've got an SBOM, how do we assure that we've actually got an SBOM that is a real, true representation of our system? Did it include the test code as well? Probably we don't want that, but some will do. Have we got a whole of the system, or have we just got the part of the component, the application we're interested in? We need to be really careful when you use the right tool. You probably saw that I want other people to use it, not just the techie team. So therefore, we need to make sure that SBOMs are accessible to other users, not just the technical community. I know we're mainly a technical community here, but actually make sure the documents is readable by your governance people because they aren't going to be fluent in JSON or XML. They want a way of actually being able to communicate that. And finally, this needs data. If you're going to use data for vulnerabilities, we need to have a database that's consistent, that's well managed. There's an MVD in the US. Is that the database we want to use globally? Because at the moment, I don't think the US recognize how many people from Europe also need that data as well. So have we got a global database supported by the industry or foundations to actually do that, to provide people to use vulnerability management effectively? And if you get it right, then you can start using some open source tools. And these are some open source tools I've written. So you can start seeing, I may be able to identify, I've got obsolete software. Great. I can give you a license tree, which I'm sure the next presentation will probably be quite interesting as well. So you can see your flow down of all your licenses. In this case, you can see all the licenses, maybe, are all correct and consistent. You can then provide your documents there, which maybe your CISO can understand, or your governance or quality people can understand. And finally, you can start putting it in a database. And that will answer your question, was I effective with Log4j? Because I can do a search across SBOMs, across a product, across an organization, across a customer base. So there's some real benefits once we get the data, but we need the data. So that's the summary, but that's really a call for action. We all need, as a community, to actually improve the data for SBOMs. So I wonder whether we should start crowdsourcing SBOMs. We all produce open source software. Are we all producing SBOMs? Let's start producing SBOMs. Let's start putting it in a repository, and let's start seeing what it tells us to do. And that's the end of the presentation. Bang, on to 0.